framework. It's probably Scaled Agile, arguably has been one of the most interesting things that have hit the Agile world in the last 3 years. It almost seems like it's come out of nowhere. And it really appealed to me in a big way because it addressed a lot of issues where we were struggling with in the Agile world. And that's what I want to share with you tonight. Just a little bit about me. Most of you, I think some of you are familiar with who I am. It's sort of been around Agile Vancouver. I was one of the co-founders of Agile Vancouver along with Philippe about, how many years ago did we found it? About 8 years ago? Yeah, 2004. So someone was remarking that I looked younger in my photos. Okay, you know, you run a user group and have a 6-year-old daughter. You see how quickly you age. But anyways, I used to be an aviation enthusiast. I've been in the industry quite a while, about 30 years, done everything from telecommunications, media. I don't know if anyone here is from the Creo alumni. Anyone had the experience of working at Creo at one time? Or NPR, MDI, okay? Yeah. So done the M Tour in Vancouver and had the opportunity to do a lot of interesting projects. So where are we going with Scaled Agile? Well, one thing that Dean Leffingwell, who's sort of the inspiration behind the Scaled Agile framework, is fond of saying, and I have to agree with him, the world runs on software. And it's kind of shocking how many of the devices now that we have actually run on software. Just even looking at an office, your Mac here. I'm going to really date myself now. When I went to SFU, did computing science, I had one of the awesome jobs that you could get as a computing science student. I was a computer operator there. That was the best thing going because it was a union job, paid well, and you got to look after one of the largest computers on the West Coast. It was an IBM 370-155. It had a whopping 4 megabytes of RAM on it. It had massive disks on it. The disks were IBM 350s, which were 350 megs. Okay, this totally outclasses that machine. So we've had a massive uptake of software. You look around the office, most of us work in buildings now where you can't even turn on a light without software being involved. Depending on whose numbers you take, the worldwide software industry is anywhere from a $1.5 trillion to $4 trillion industry. It is likely the largest industry on the planet. So we are working in a massive, successful industry that has generated a lot of wealth. The challenge we're facing is because of our success, and this is the way I like to look at it, because we have been so successful as software developers. The world is asking more and more from us. They want more software, higher quality, and they want it faster. You know, when I first started in this industry, you know, 18-month to 2-year projects were the norm. Some projects were even longer. Now, companies are struggling to try and dream of getting software out even every quarter. And that's the kind of world we're trying to work in now. So we've really pushed a lot of our methods as far as they can go. And we're trying to say, is there something we can do more? The Agile methods were really holding out a lot of hope. This was awesome. You know, there was this really neat uptake. We started seeing a lot of success from Agile projects. People started doing Scrum, they started doing XP, they started doing Kanban, and we started seeing a lot of good reports. We were seeing cost of product, we were seeing customer satisfaction going up, we were seeing lower costs, we were seeing more product coming out with higher quality. The challenge though, what if this is your project? This is a John Deere 8000 series tractor. Okay, this is your basic workhorse farm tractor, runs on average about $500,000. 30% of the capital cost of that thing is software. This thing is a robot, right? This thing is amazingly smart. Who saw the movie Cars? All right. Remember when Mater and Lightning McQueen, they went out and tipped tractors and they were going, tractors are so dumb? I said, this machine here knows exactly where it dropped a seed within 2 centimeters. Yeah, this, like I said, there's an amazing amount of technology. The only reason this machine needs a driver is to make sure some damn fool doesn't run out in front of it. So there's a huge amount of software in this thing, and I've got a whole new respect for agricultural technology. This little thing on top of here, this is called Green Star. That's the trade name for the precision mechanism. This is a GPS plus a GPS correction mechanism for the tractor. There's about 300 people who were involved in designing that little dome. And that was one of the major projects that we did. So how do you take a methodology that talks about a team of 7 plus or minus 2 people, weekly or bi-weekly sprints, story cards, and build that? How do we get the same success with Agile that we've seen at the team level on the program and enterprise level? And that's kind of where the Scaled Agile framework comes in. The intent behind this is to address the issue of agility at the program level and also at the enterprise level. A lot of us are working in environments. Who is working in an environment where the teams are executing fairly well? You've got Agile teams scattered around the organization, but your portfolio and project management is still very much waterfall based. How many are operating in those environments? Yeah. So the challenge you've got, what are some of the challenges you're finding in there?
Communication.
Communications? Specifically, what are you thinking there?
Well, I think you know the environment that I'm talking about, but you've got very disparate groups that simply don't, there's a wall between them.
Yeah. You throw it over the wall, the silo mentality.
Justification of how you measure by management what you're doing with Agile project. Trying to measure what features you're going to deliver when.
Yeah. So yeah, more of the push process rather than sort of what we'd like to think of in Lean as a pull process. We're working against a schedule rather than focusing on value.
We get the iron triangle gets set early on, and you can get agreement that will vary content or will vary deadline and keep content or whatever choice is made, and then the deadline for some release comes along or some customer's asking, all of a sudden the priorities change, right? Everyone shuffles the iron triangles, and all of a sudden we're varying resources or we're varying content, and you plan your whole, every one of your sprints around the other option.
Yeah. So we've gone out and planned against the options, and therefore we're generating a lot of waste. Because now we have to throw away that plan and replan that again.
I like the prioritization bun fight.
Yeah.
And the problem that you see there is certain priorities kind of on that one get unhinged as the business is changing so fast, but it's taking so long to execute on the project.
I mean, certainly we want to be able to have the flexibility in the Agile world that as the priorities change. But the question is, as the priorities change, what impact, how much waste does that create in our project? Because if we've gone ahead and generated a lot of inventory, a lot of intermediate work products, we're doing late integration with the overall system. Again, we run into this issue where the teams are executing well, right? We have Scrum teams or we have XP teams, but we run into this challenge where we're executing well, but strategically, we're creating a lot of waste. Does that resonate? Okay. So this is really what the Scaled Agile framework is. In a definition, this is from, some of this material was taken directly from Scaled Agile. And Scaled Agile framework, as defined by Dean Leffingwell, who was one of the inspirations behind it, the Scaled Agile framework is a proven publicly facing framework, emphasis on the word framework, publicly facing, for applying lean and agile practices at the enterprise scale. So we are actually trying to build a framework that we can align teams, programs, and portfolio to the enterprise. Generally, what we found is works well for teams of 50 to 100 people. I've actually deployed this with teams of over 200 people. I was involved at John Deere extensively. That was probably the major site that everyone talks about in the scaled agile world. The reason they do is John Deere was very open about what they were doing. A lot of organizations prefer not to be in the public spotlight. John Deere was very willing to talk about all that was happening and what was happening there. Chad Holdorf was one of the lead engineers there who sort of put his career at risk to roll out SAFE there. Just to show you what I mean by publicly facing. So this is SAFE. It's at www.scaledagilepFramework.com. How many of you remember RUP, Rational Unified Process? Okay? What was one of the major features of RUP? Okay. I'm going to put you on the spot, Philippe.
No clue. Well, you should tailor it first before jumping and filling up the forms.
Yeah, that's true. One of the things about RUP, or one of the key things about SAFE, it's basically a website. It's completely live, so I can mouse over any of the icons here. For example, I've got the product management team here, and if my internet connection is working well, I'm tethering through my phone. Anyone here from Rogers? Right. And I'm on the LTE network too. Okay. Well, imagine, if you will, for a moment, that all of these items are live. You can basically mouse over them, get further information, guidance. So you can explore the framework. That is meant by publicly facing. One of the emphasis too is I'd like to say it is a framework. There's a wonderful debate taking place in the Agile community. I don't know, did anyone go to Agile 2013 last year? There was a huge kerfuffle at Agile 2013. Ken Schwaber started tweeting away that SAFE is unsafe, and people were saying this is the revenge of RUP. And it was all very amusing. And I took it as it's a framework. The one thing I very much like about SAFE is at least somebody took the time to put pen to paper or get into basically a web editor. Define roles, define workflows, define processes, and at least put something together on paper and put it up to the public and say, here's our thoughts on how we can scale Agile from the team through to the enterprise. And here's some answers to problems we have seen at different organizations. Now, for example, I don't fully agree with everything in SAFE, but I'm working with clients. This is an awesome framework to at least sit down and say, let's talk about it. Where are the issues? Not everyone fully buys into the portfolio management. They want some variation of this. But at least we can say, yeah, I like that. I'm not sure I'm good with that. What practice should we put in place of that? That at least gives us something. It also explains, like, okay, who's a BA or who's an architect here? Who's got the job title of architect or does, okay? Most Agile methods, is there an architecture role defined? No. Is there a BA role defined? You know, we generally say these are skills that work on the team, but in a large project, there are definitely going to be enterprise architects. There are going to be enterprise BAs. How do they interact with all the teams? How do they interact with product managers? It at least gives us some way to answer those questions. That when somebody says, look, we've got, this Agile stuff is nice. I can get that for the 7 plus or minus 2 people. We've got 200 people trying to work on a project to deliver an enterprise service. Or we're building a tractor. And we've got to get this puppy out for the planting season. How are we going to do this? At least it gives us some way to sit down and have that discussion. How are we all going to work together? And it's still not going anywhere. Okay. The key thing behind the Scaled Agile framework is it's trying to bring lean and agile practices to the enterprise. So it's a framework that says, ultimately, how do we bring lean practices into the enterprise? That's one of the goals here. Dean is a huge fan. Who's read Donald Reinerstein's book or seen Donald Reinerstein's book, Product Development Flow? Okay, it's a pretty dense book. It's basically one of those books that, if you're really cool on it, you get together with your colleagues at work and you take a chapter or you take one of the principles and you study it for a week. But some of the concepts in it are very straightforward, and the intent behind the Scaled Agile framework is to try and implement lean principles across the enterprise. So it's a framework for saying, how do we become lean across the enterprise? In fact, if you look, we'll come back to this later, it's hard to see, but up here in the little corner, there's the so-called House of Lean. And really, the practices, as Dean would say, this is what we think the state of the art is currently. So given that the state of the art, these are the best practices as represented by the Scaled Agile framework for helping us have a lean enterprise. If we discover better practices in future, then we will use those practices. So this is an evolving framework. Again, emphasis on that word framework. I don't want to get into methodology wars. As I said, I have some serious disagreements with some aspects of the framework. But again, I can sit down and have a principled discussion to say why I don't like those and what alternative would I have put in place. So let's just take a little bit of a look at the origins. Dean Leffingwell, he's been around. Philippe, you worked with him at one time. Dean's been everything from CEO, he was working with Rational. I always joke, he was one of the founders of Requisite Pro. Sometimes I joke that, okay, don't ever tell Dean I said this. I always joke sometimes, friends don't let friends use Requisite Pro. But, very bad joke. So I became aware, started getting involved with, there's been other participants in the development of the Scaled Agile framework. Dean has certainly been the center of gravity for this. One of the driving things for Dean was to get this lean and agile practices for the enterprise. He became involved with Al Shalloway, Drew Gemolo, Alex Yakima, who had a significant influence on this. I became involved initially for a while. We met at Agile 2010. And I participated a bit in that, then I got distracted, and then became involved with them again in 2011 at John Deere. A couple of books is Agile Software Requirements. This is Dean's book. The book is probably the worst titled book ever. It's actually the book that really describes SAFe. He called it Agile Software Requirements, but it really describes. A question? Okay. Some of the roots of it, lean thinking, definitely iterative and incremental development, agile development, product development flow, a lot of the concepts for how to bring lean concepts into the design process by Donald Reinerstein, and a lot of field experience. The process has undergone a number of generations as we picked up more experience in its deployments. The results, I can speak to John Deere because I was with them for 18 months. We took 3 different divisions. I took 3 different divisions through transformation. One was the Intelligent Systems Group, the guys who make the tractors smart. Power Systems, which was the really cool one because those are the guys who build the engines. So I got to play with 600 horsepower diesels. Anyone here a mechanical engineer? Okay, this is what you dream of. You know, engines that make lots of noise, and you can do really fun things with it. That was very cool. And then the big group was Tractor System Electronics. They build the entire electronics backbones for the tractor. And that was over 250 people. And that was a very, very cool deployment. So John Deere was probably one of the most exciting groups there. My involvement came with them, with ISG initially, the Intelligent Systems Group, where they were following a waterfall project and they were in basically bug fix hell. They were at the tail end of a waterfall and they were in that typical horrible case where, how many of you have had this before? Their defect opening rate was accelerating and their defect closing rate was decelerating. Okay, who's had that happen to them? Yeah, not a fun situation. And the tractor business is one that there are 2 seasons in which you can sell tractors. Planting season and harvest season. If you miss those, you might as well not have started the project. And this project was seriously dead in the water. You went in there and you could feel the dejection. Chad Holdorf really was one of the lead engineers. He put his career on the line. Basically, this was a Hail Mary pass. He said, we're dead in the water. Why don't we try something different? Because he had talked to Dean. We went in there and we shut the project down for 2 weeks. We trained 150 engineers for ISG and then restarted the project. And I don't want to say it was safe, that was this miraculous cure, but everyone's attitude went from we're all dead to we have a fighting chance. One of the main things that happened was getting the groups to work together, talk to each other, plan with each other, and also, most importantly, being able to focus on the highest priority problems to get solved. The result was we got the product out. And as they progressed to develop the team, some pretty neat things started to happen. You know, their warranty expense started dropping. They were getting to market faster. Time to production was faster. Field resolution time was down. This is across a group of 150 people. Now, if you're a project manager or software development manager here, this number right here, I think, is huge for you. Think about this for a moment. Think about the burn rate on your project. How much money is your project burning every day? Regardless of whether you get something out or not, just your fixed cost. What if you could get product out 20% faster? 20% of the days drop out of your schedule. What's that worth to you? BMC Software Insurance Company, more responsive to market changes, productivity up 20 to 50%. Discount Tire, productivity increased by 20 to 25%. Nearly 0 defects after each tire store system release. Okay, who does point of sale here? Anyone do point of sale? Once upon a time? So, you roll out a release. The odds of having 0 defects?
That's unheard.
That's unheard of. That's what they were able to hit. TradeStation. Best experience and technology. So definitely results. I've rolled this out in 6 different clients now. The number, personally, I would say all of these have been successful rollouts. So John Deere was some of the largest. I've worked with a major bank in the US. I've worked with one of the coolest home automation companies out of Salt Lake City. Though Salt Lake City is not that cool. Actually, it is. I shouldn't say that. That's not nice. I would say a great deal of success that I've seen in the rollouts of using Scaled Agile. Certainly variations based on the needs of the customer, but the framework really helped to bring people together. So, how does it work? Okay, so this is our project here. We're going to do an 8000 series tractor. Well, we're not going to do the whole tractor. We're just going to do the Green Star. Basic philosophy here. We know how Agile is well understood for teams. We've got lots of good guidance on how to do Agile for a team. Who is working on an Agile team right now? Okay? You feel like the team's working pretty well? Like we've got it, we've got the basic problems that happen with software development, but as an Agile team, we've got it sussed out reasonably well. Is that a fair statement? So the question is, how do we take those practices? How do we take that ideal? This is going back, right? The problem is, the original problem, the world runs on software. We're being asked for more. Our methodologies aren't keeping up. We thought Agile was going to really help us. It did. But it helped us at the team level. How do we take that up to the enterprise? And one of the things that we have to acknowledge that if we're going to make things bigger, if we're going to have more people working on larger projects, we are going to have more guidance in place. And I absolutely love this quote from Wayne Stevens, who was at IBM for a number of years. He said, if only a few drivers cross a large parking lot at night, when there are no other cars, it doesn't matter where they drive. Okay, so us, okay? We're going to go out to, let's say, the YVR parking lot, right? We get in our cars, and we're just going to drive around. Right? The only rule we have to have is stay out of my way. That's basically it, right? Now, all of us are going to get into our cars and drive in a parking lot. Is stay out of my way the only rule we need? If that's the only rule we have, what do you think is going to happen? A lot of ICBC claims. Okay? So to avoid that, we have to say, okay, as the number of cars moving through the parking lot increases, eventually it does matter. With the increasing number of drivers, it becomes more important that they establish and follow conventions about parking, driving lanes, and stop signs. So we have to add more rules. We want to stick with the Agile principles. As Jim Highsmith said, we want to have a barely sufficient methodology. But just saying, yeah, every 2 weeks we get together, we plan, and we deliver is not sufficient if we're delivering a multi-million-dollar project. Okay? Most of us probably even have little things like people want to know what they're going to get for $1 million or more. You probably have some budgeting process in your organization, and they want some confidence that they're going to get what they paid for. So we have to have some rules in place to help us through here. So we have to scale up. And Agile scale, what the Scaled Agile framework says, okay, we're going to scale along several dimensions. We're definitely going to have bigger teams. We're going to have bigger stories, because if we have a very large system, you can imagine, what, are we going to write this all in little user stories? So the stories are going to be bigger. We're going to have a bigger planning session. We're going to have longer time boxes. And you go, whoa, 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 wait a minute, Steve. No. Bigger teams, bigger time boxes, bigger stories. That sounds like we're going back, aren't we losing our agility? How do we reconcile that need that we're definitely dealing with larger scale features, and how do we preserve this agility to be able to embrace change? So we have to look at some of the mechanisms here, how we can do that. Okay, first of all, we have to deal with people. How do we build up our team? How do we go from 7 plus or minus 2 people to 200 people? Well, basically the guidance in Scrum and in most Agile methods is don't increase the team size. Add teams. So we basically saying, okay, if we need more people, we add more teams. And generally, in the perfect world of Scrum, we all pull from the same backlog. But the first rule is, okay, if we're going to have to increase the number of people, we have to increase the number of teams. You know, we don't start having teams of 20, Scrum teams of 20 people or XP teams of 20 people. We keep the teams to 7 plus or minus 2 people. Any guess as to why that is? What happens if you have 15 people on a team? Beg pardon?
Meetings take too long. Meetings take too long.
The meetings take too long.
It also increases your communication variables.
Increases the communications variables. And will a team of 15 people stay as one team? No, factions form. Anyways, it will naturally go into 2 teams or 3 teams. So we want to keep the teams at a level where we can manage the communications and keep the meetings manageable. So that, you know, it's always that 7 plus or minus 2 seems to be a magic number. We also need to deal with bigger stories. Okay? The features for this thing are going to be massive. Are we going to be able to represent all the features for that, for let's say a $5 million project, using right-sized stories? Like the ideal in the Agile world here is that our stories should be implementable in 2 or 3 days. That's sort of the gold standard in Scrum or XP. Can you imagine how many stories we would need for something like that, for a tractor? So we have to come up with some mechanism whereby we can have our stories for the team, but yet be able to link them to larger scale features. Now, I assume most of you are familiar. How many of you are familiar with the concept of an epic? Okay, what's an epic?
Giant feature.
Beg pardon?
Giant feature.
A giant feature. All right? So yeah, generally the definition of an epic, it's a big feature. It can be broken down into smaller stories. This is one of the areas I have a bit of a problem with SAFe. It has a very specific definition of an epic. So in SAFe, we have stories. So stories are things you can do in a sprint. Okay, SAFe is very Scrum, is sort of very Scrum-centric. It sort of tends to use a lot of the terminology from Scrum at the team level. So your story is still your story. And you have features. So the feature sort of corresponds to your idea of what we would think of an epic. It represents a feature, it's something of value to our stakeholder, and that's something we're going to implement. And then we have this idea of a big epic. And the epic is something that's really big. Like generally a feature is something that we're going to build in a release. Epics span releases. So it's a little bit of a different definition than we're used to traditionally. You know, and a lot of bottles of wine have been drunk over this and arguments over this. You know, and it's just, okay, I understand the reasoning and the logic behind it, and I can swallow and say, okay, I can deal with that. But it does take a little bit of a while if you're used to a more traditional definition of an epic, is that yes, there is a concept of a story which represents the fine-grained features that at the team level we're going to work within a sprint. The feature is something that as a team or as a program we're interested in delivering. And an epic represents a major initiative. Sometimes even at the scale of what we would call a project, potentially, within a program.
How is that structure different from your classic work breakdown structure?
Okay, did everyone hear the question? How does this differ from a traditional work breakdown structure? What are we doing with a traditional work breakdown structure? Who's a project manager here? Who will admit that they're a project manager? Okay, so you have a feature. How do you break it? What do you break it down into?
Using Agile or waterfall?
Let's say you're doing traditional waterfall.
I look at what needs to be completed when, so deadlines, milestones, and break it down for the narrative. You can't break it down any further.
So you break it down, and what do you break it down into?
Work packages?
Work packages. And are those work packages more, we'll do the analysis of this feature, this person, the BA will do analysis of this feature, the designer will do...
Yeah, it's work packages that can be handled by one of those others, essentially.
So typically, in the answer to the question, and I said it gets a little bit fuzzy, but the difference, what I would say, would be the differentiating characteristic of this versus a traditional work breakdown structure is the focus is we're trying to deliver a working feature. The work breakdown structure may take something like the epic and break it down into tasks. I'm going to do some analysis on it, I'm going to do some design, whereas this is actually breaking the epic down into deliverable features, breaking the deliverable features into deliverable stories. So the story is representing a unit of, hopefully, in the ideal world, is representing something that can be completely implemented. Designed, analyzed, designed, implemented, tested, delivered. And so you could look at this as a value-based breakdown structure versus a work breakdown structure. Now a sharp project manager may actually say, okay, can I build a work package and give that to one person and they deliver some element of value. But the intent is that as we break this down, the ideal would be that's one little piece of the feature, this runs, and as we implement all the stories for a feature, we're progressively implementing that feature. We always have something that we can deliver, something of value that we can deliver. So very much the idea, the differentiating characteristic here, are we delivering something of value?
How would that be different than a work breakdown structure in that, I mean, what we're running horizontally here feels like a vertical stream work breakdown structure in terms of the stories, my activities, and if I have verified those activities with my sponsored stakeholders, I should have, they should be able to verify value, like the value of those activities, i.e. the outcomes.
It depends on what it comes down to. The short answer, I would say, it depends on what you determine as value. What I'm looking at value here is if I have a feature, can I give you something, some vertical slice of that feature? So I'm thinking the best way I could visualize that is I am slicing out that feature into vertical strips that each are implemented and running. So I'm taking it through the full development cycle. Analysis, design, implementation, test. Such that if you pulled my funding from me, and when I've only invested 60% of my effort, you've got 60% of a working feature. Whereas the traditional approach, if we're taking a more horizontal approach, may say, I've invested 60% of my effort, but I don't have anything that I can actually deliver. Now there's variations, because you could see, depending on the project manager, how you might split that up.
Is this similar to like the Agile pyramid? Basically epics, themes, user stories?
Beg pardon?
Agile pyramid, basically epics, themes, and user stories. We've got like the large, giant stuff
Yeah.
at the top, broken down into the themes.
That's precisely it. Yeah, and I think this is one of the issues, is getting used to this. It's very much, there's been a lot of nomenclature dealing with stories. How do we deal with big stories? I mean, there's been themes, I've heard of sagas. So, I mean, okay, you just have to get used to, this is the nomenclature that's being used in SAFe. So it gives us this kind of structure, coming back to your questionnaire there. So we have, like, say, a large epic. As a farmer, I need a powerful, reliable tractor to work my field so I can be productive. So we can break that into a set of features. As a farmer, I need a power takeoff shaft. As a farmer, I need to minimize input so I can lower my costs. As a farmer, I need a high horsepower and torque to pull heavy implements. So here's the major features on a tractor, for example. I need front loader buckets so I can manage my fields. Okay, so now I need to minimize my inputs. As a farmer, I need precision planting to minimize my needs for seeds. We can progressively break this down. By implementing these stories here that came from, as a farmer, I need to minimize my inputs so I can lower my costs, we could say that progressively implementing these is showing us earned value realistically by delivering something of value. So this is the way what we're trying to do, and I mean this is pretty much Agile, in many ways, Agile 200, not Agile 101, but Agile 200, how to represent a story hierarchy using epics and stories. Here we have an intermediate level, epics, features, and stories.
So I'm struggling to see how this is based Agile where maybe I need to understand better the definitions. I actually read the book and it was a while ago, so it's starting to come back to me. But I remember reading the book and thinking to myself, oh well, features, he's kind of using features in a new way, I guess. But, so if I think back to how we're using Agile at my company, you could just replace this hierarchy with epic stories and developer tasks that make up the story.
The specific definition of a feature and the difference between a feature, for example, and an epic. A story is something you can do basically in one sprint.
Right.
A feature is something you can do in what's called a release. It's sort of a big sprint.
Okay.
We'll talk about that in a couple
So I
moments.
understand releases.
The epic is something that spans releases.
Understand releases as well. Okay.
Yeah, and that's the differentiator.
Okay. Okay.
But realistically, yes. You know, if you think about it, well, how is this different from how I've learned Agile in the past? It's that distinction, but philosophically, it's still the same. We have bigger stories, whether you want to call them themes. You know, in SAFe, it's called an epic now. We break it down into smaller stories, which can be called features that we plan into releases, and those can break down into stories, which we put into sprints.
So Leffingwell qualifies the word epic by calling it either a business epic or an architectural epic.
Yes.
So I think it helps to remember that, because if you just think of epic, then you think about your old definition of epic, whatever that might have been.
That's true. So Dean basically differentiates between what are called business epics. This is one of the controversy, again, this is one of those big bottle of wine discussions I have, because I've always regarded architecture as a first-class citizen. In SAFe, he explicitly calls it out. So there's epics coming from the business, and there's epics coming from architecture. And these are all scheduled, but he explicitly calls out architecture. And each carries equal weight. You evaluate them, you prioritize them. But I've always thought, why differentiate them? They're all epics. But I agree, you can't differentiate them as business or architectural epics. And maybe to highlight architecture and make it a first-class citizen, that's what was necessary.
But he could have called them foobar epics, and then it still would have been distinct from the old definition of epics.
Yeah. Okay, I need to move on here. Sorry. So, what we can do here is, in a lot of worlds, Scrum says, okay, perfect world is to have all the teams pull from one backlog. In SAFe, we say, okay, what we're going to have for a program is we're going to have a number of teams associated with the program. The teams have backlogs of stories. And then we have a second backlog called the program backlog, where we have our features for that program. And that's managed by a product. This has a product manager, and each one of these here has a typical product owner. This has worked. One of the things that a lot of people have really liked about this, the comment that I have, who here has had the job of being a product owner? Is it an easy job?
Not if you stay in the strict definition. You have to do a lot more to make it happen.
It's almost an impossible job for one person to do. And a comment I've had from a lot of product managers who've ended up being product owners is, I don't give a bleepity bleep what happens every 2 weeks. I want to see a fully implemented feature. That's what's important to me. And when the product manager took over this role here and was able to prioritize features into a program backlog, and they saw something every month or every 2 months, they were beside themselves, because they could do their job, go out in the field, talk to customers, worry about features, and see the teams delivering features. The product owners here will be tied to the hip to the product manager, carry out their instructions, but be able to work together such that the teams could prioritize their backlogs such that we met the wishes of the product manager. We'll go into this a little bit more in a few moments. So obviously, if we got these big features, we're going to need a bigger time box. We're not going to get a feature implemented in 2 weeks, most likely. So we obviously need a bigger time box as well. In the safe world, we have this idea of releases. Now, pre-safe, working with releases has long been a common Agile concept. Who's done release planning at one time, whether or not you were using safe or not? Right, so what is release planning?
All the functionality that you require so that you have a working piece of software to release to your customers.
Yeah.
For your product.
Yeah, it's a bit of a, it's a look ahead, say, so what's the time span, what's the duration of a release that you might be looking at?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. So some of you are working on a very fast cycle. Some organizations will do like a release planning where they're using a 2-month cadence, which tends to be fairly popular, or even a quarterly cadence. And what they're doing is they're saying, okay, in release planning, what do we want to deliver at the end of the release? So what features, what do we want to actually put in the hands of the customer in 2 months, 3 months, or a month, whatever we decide our cadence is. And then depending on what our cadence for our iterations are, or sprints, let's just see if there's a possible way that we can line up the stories that there might be a path to getting there. We're not committing the sprints right now, but we just, at the beginning here, we just want to see that given what we know of the world today, is there a possible path to reaching our release objectives? So we all get together, we do that, and that's release planning. So we're trying to give ourselves some mid-range planning here. And so this release becomes a bigger time box. So we plan still, our teams are still planning on a 1 week or 2 week cadence. Is anyone using a longer cadence than 2 weeks for a sprint? About a month? Do you do release planning as well?
No, no. It's one per.
One per. A lot of teams do about a 2 week, so they get that fast feedback. But we have that sort of mid-range planning so that, okay, what are we working towards? What are the release objectives we're working towards? And then we're able to build actually a roadmap of releases to say, what do we want to see in the future? And that's the way a lot of projects work. So we get the same benefit at a larger scale of having a regular cadence, like 2 weeks or what our regular sprint cadence is. We get that at a larger, we get this sort of release of features. So here, we're delivering stories. Here, we're releasing features. And that's why this feature concept becomes important, because it's a feature in Scaled Agile that can be delivered, that has to be delivered in one release. Or sometimes some people hate the term release, and I do have a problem with the word release, because it doesn't mean you're putting it out into the field. So we call it a PSI, a potentially shippable increment. Okay? The best term I like is mid-range planning horizon. But that's what it is. It's saying, okay, we're going to plan out the next couple of months. The important thing here is you're not taking away the freedom of the team or the ability of the team to adapt, but you're trying to give them some reaction, because as they execute, things happen. Opportunities come up and issues happen. But we're just trying to see, is there some credible way that we can reach the release objectives? Let's know now at the beginning that it's impossible, rather than to blindly go in and assuming everything will work fine. So we can build out a roadmap. Now, one of the important things here too is in SAFE, all the teams that are participating in the project operate on a cadence, on the same cadence. Everybody has their sprint planning the same day. The sprints if we decide that 2 weeks is our sprint cadence, everybody has a 2-week sprint. We plan on the same day. We finish on the same day. We do our demo and retrospective on the same day. Anybody have a reason why? Why would we do that? Especially combined with release planning.
Part of it is to get the organization on the same cadence. That's part of it.
Part of it.
It's possible to
You want it to be shippable, so they all gotta be done at the same time.
Right, they've all got to match up at the same time. And, okay, let's see, you guys here, all right, you're building the tractor transmission, right? You're building the diesel, okay? Basically, the power takeoff shaft has to match with the transmission, right? What have you got there? It starts with a D. You got a dependency, right? And so we have got to see that if this team has a dependency on this team that way, that we've got to match our transmission to their engine. Then we have to sit down and talk with that team and say, okay, since we have a dependency on you, can you make sure you get that implemented in this sprint, and then we'll take your work and we'll use it. So it's one of the important reasons when we're doing this release planning, we have multiple teams, we would strongly prefer all the teams be planning and working on the same cadence so that we can manage dependencies. I've been in organizations where some teams are working on 3-week cadences, some are working on 2, they had dependencies, and it was basically an ad hoc negotiation.
Maybe a silly question, because I don't have an Agile background, but is the quality, is there a quality, because I'm imagining if you're taking something that's just been done in a sprint and going to somewhat other team to build on that, has there been any tests in between to verify that it works?
Depends. Okay? I'm a consultant. What's the classic consultant phrase? Depends. It depends. In theory, this team has all the automation, test-driven development, test systems such that when they do continuous integration and build, continuous deployment, so it's beautifully, perfectly tested. In practice, yeah, right. Okay? So typically, what will happen is if this team is dumping something on this team, it will be practically what I've seen, it's at best been smoke tested. Okay, that we're giving it to this team with a bunch of caveats. It's been smoke tested to some level, but we're not going to guarantee it. There is something in SAFe that causes all kinds of people to get their backs up and scream and cry and wail and gnash their teeth. Johnny, what is it?
The HIP.
Beg pardon?
HIP? HIP?
Yeah. A hardening sprint. All right? There's a lot of people who, if they're running, let's say, running 2-week sprints on a 2-month cadence, the 4th sprint is what's known as the HIP or the hardening sprint. Now, a lot of Agile purists scream, this is evil, this is horrible, this is not Agile. The reality is, if you've got 20 teams trying to bring their work together on a tractor platform, yes, you're going to have to put a time where we're all going to regress this stuff. So often what a lot of organizations do is there's no new stories that go into this last sprint. That's where we pull the stories together and run our full regression suite. Now the key thing on that hardening sprint, this is not the dumping ground for your crap. Okay, you don't snowplow all your defects into that. We're going into that with as few defects as possible, and the intent is that because our testing procedures and our quality assurance processes do not enable us to have fully automated testing, that's a tax we're paying. But the reality is, yeah, who works in systems environments where you have a mix of hardware, software, and getting test time on the test bed is just really tricky. Okay, this is sometimes just a necessity. You try to work to minimize this, but it is a necessity. It sometimes is there. So what we end up with is something that looks like this. We've got a program backlog. We've got these releases. At the end of each release, we have a potentially shippable increment. Now here's a question. Who works in an environment where People are split across multiple projects. Okay. This is that's a real issue. I was at an HMO in the US. They had 30 teams and 60 projects. And it was chaos. And what we tried to do, we don't get to a perfect solution, but one of the important things we try to do is say, look, in the Agile world, don't bring the team to the work. Bring the work to the team. Create a stable team. And then multiplex the work from the different projects to the teams. So that program backlog can actually be made up of work that is coming from multiple projects. And then the team can decide how they mix that work. Now, it's not going to work in every situation. But you want to bias yourselves to, as much towards that as possible. Because splitting the team splitting up people individually across multiple projects, you're paying a massive, massive tax. Any organization where I've done an Agile transformation, and we've been able to consolidate people on one team, and then they take on multiple projects, we've basically got 30% back. That was that was found money for the company. It's like their headcount went up 30%. Just because people were not always having to race around, find one another, juggle multiple projects, didn't have to do the context switching. So let's just give you a thought here. Of course, we have the feedback, inspect, and adapt cycles at the end. Just like we have at each sprint, we have a retrospective, but we also have the inspect and adapt workshop at the end of each release. So what you're seeing here is the structure, the program level structure in SAFe is basically imagine what you would do in a sprint. Just grow it up. Make the stories bigger, make the inspect and adapt workshops bigger, make the release planning bigger. That's what you're trying to do here. So we need to scale planning. This is the thing that hooked me into SAFe big time, was the release planning workshop. The first time I did this was at John Deere, 150 people in the room. Every participant, every stakeholder who had an interest in the ISG, in the Green Star system, was in the room, planning together. 2-day workshop. This was, like I said, this is the pure gold. If you take nothing else away from it, every 2 months at John Deere, the entire company does this. Everybody at John Deere has a little calendar in their wallet where their planning cycles are. And everyone knows. And John Deere has people in Pune, India, Waterloo, Iowa. Bet you didn't know there was a Waterloo, Iowa. Fargo, Mannheim, Germany. They all plan together. They even fly the guys, they'll fly guys from Waterloo to Pune, Pune to Waterloo to Mannheim to get the teams to all work together. They feel that it's worth putting people onto planes and moving them around because the benefits they're getting from the release planning sessions is so massive. They said, even if you take nothing else away from SAFe, this is huge.
So a question on that is, kind of a follow-up to this, is there any way, or do you have this in a way that you could train somebody to train the trainer? Do you have this type of workshop?
Yep. And if you come to the Scaled Agile, there's several training programs that are provided through Scaled Agile Academy. One is the Scaled Agile, the Leading SAFe, which is coming up which I'll be offering in a month. There's also what John Herman, myself have gone through. We are scaled Agile program consultants, so we've got additional training to lead that and to basically train the trainers. So there are definitely these programs available.
The problem I have is chasing down the stakeholders. If they're all there and we get the backlogs up, get everybody together, we can have a big meditation, so to speak, on what we're going to do. Yeah, that's easy.
Yeah. I think the key thing here is you've got to convince them. You know, the stakeholders are running most stakeholders I know are running 5 directions at once. It's convincing, establishing the value of this. And I said, the history, I say, this is an amazing, to me, this is one of the most amazing things. Everybody sees the value in this.
There is also training that can precede the actual first time that you do this, so that people go into the meeting, it's not like a total mystery to them. They kind of sort of foresee what's going to happen, and when they get there, they can actually execute. They use the 2 days wisely.
Yes. Yeah, you don't want everyone to go in cold. That's the one thing you don't want to do. Okay. So, one of the last things here is, for SAFE, this is a common model that we see in a lot of organizations. Basically, the scrum or fall or water scrumming process. You know, the agility works for the team, maybe even partially up to the program level, and then we hit the enterprise, we hit the PMO, and we're back to waterfall. So we're executing really well, but we don't have the flexibility to adapt to changing market conditions or changing needs of the enterprise. And this is inherently where we have the conflict. So there's a definite change in the way we do portfolio management. And what happens within SAFE is we have a portfolio backlog where the major initiatives, this is where we see the epics, sort of these mini projects. We have a backlog of those. They're broken down into business ethics or architectural ethics. The portfolio backlog feeds the various program backlogs, which feeds the various team backlogs. What we see here, this is what I really love in SAFE, is we get this alignment between the strategy of the business and the team. 9 times out of 10, what I have discovered is most software developers do not know how the work they're doing contributes to the overall benefit of the business. Here we have the ability to tie the stories back to the features, back to the epics that drive the business. So we see a connection between product managers, product owners, and the teams. We get here where we can centralize the strategy of the organization. So we can say that the organization has the power to set its strategy centrally, but we have basically we are able to distribute the execution. The teams control the execution of the strategy. So our executive, our PMO is able to steer this ship. The teams are able to drive it forward. So that's what gets us back to here. So now, putting all those pieces together, you can orient yourself a little bit better on this diagram. There's our team here's our team. Here's a team backlog. Here are the individual sprint cycles. So here's 1, 2, 3, possibly 4 sprints. Maybe a hardening sprint, maybe not. There's a release. There's our next release. Here's our stories. Here is the program backlog that feeds the team backlogs. We have here the release planning sessions where the teams are able to plan out their next 4 sprints, but the teams still have the power to do their individual planning on each sprint here. The program backlog. We have product manager. That's driven by a roadmap and a vision. That is connected to the portfolio level where we have basically a backlog of epics. At the team level, the teams are basically what we have called Scrum XP. So Scrum I look at as a way of organizing people. It's not really a software methodology. We draw engineering practice from extreme programming. So this is the basic building block at the team level, the so-called Scrum XP teams. We bring that up to the program level. Now, the way we organize teams is we look for these value streams, and these value streams end up becoming what we call a release train. So this is a really tricky part. We come in and say, okay, we're going to start using SAFE. One of the things we want to look at is try to map out these value streams. It's not just getting a bunch of random teams together, throw them into a bucket and say, all right, now you guys are a program. It's looking at what teams do we have here that are delivering a value stream? And we're going to call that a release train. So this is the big building block. This is that program level thing, this so-called release train here. And what it's doing, it's the big box. This is the most important, getting the teams aligned to a common vision. The teams are doing release planning as a release train. They're working with the product manager. They're doing this big release planning session. That gets them aligned. The teams are able to manage their interdependencies. It's one of the coolest things when you're watching this release planning. You've got the teams all around the walls. People are running back and forth, screaming at each other, grabbing stories from one another's walls. They're building up a dependency matrix, and they're solving the problems. It's really, it's a really neat experience. SAFE as a framework is giving everyone a common language. That's one of the nice things about it. We say we're adopting a framework, we're going to use a common language. We're going to integrate all the various nomenclatures and try say that we're going to speak the same language here. But we still adhere to our Agile values of being self-organizing and self-managing. These release trains, typically about 8 to 10 weeks. I find a lot of organizations do like to go to 12 because it matches their quarterly release. It just seems to be viscerally satisfying. Again, like, time box for a team, shorter is always better. I find 2 months is definitely, for a lot of organizations, a real sweet spot. Some tend to be faster. They operate 1 week sprints and have a 1 month release cycle. That tends to be more web developers. Portfolio level, this is sort of replacing this is basically what used to be what we think of the PMO. We're now coming to the Agile PMO, where we have a whole we're looking at different initiatives here, we're breaking them down into smaller epics, and we're seeing how those epics are going to break down into features. So we have a whole new mechanism here for launching initiatives. So again, basically putting all those pieces together, you've got this framework to bring agility to the enterprise. One last thing I want to say here is, this is a framework for bringing in lean principles into the organization. How do we make it lean? And Dean is very big on this so-called house of lean. We talked about those Agile release trains. Lean is defined as basically delivering value. So it's really bringing focus that the purpose of the release train is to deliver value. And we're trying to create more value by reducing waste. And everybody and their uncle who's talked about lean has some kind of house of lean diagram. Taiichi Ohno drew one up, and then everyone decided, okay, I'm going to come up with a house of lean. Dean's got one here. So our goal here, sustainable shortest lead time, best quality and value to people and society, most customer delight, lowest cost, high morale, safety. That's our goal. That's the roof. The pillars this stands on, respect for people. So a lot of the Agile values we hold dear. Product development flow, much of the theory that's coming from Donald Reinerston. And continuous improvement. SAFE is a way of getting started on a path of building a better process. Of course, the foundation is always, do we have the support of management to do this? And getting them signed on. There's one quote here that I would like to show you off this slide here. The values, speed, value, quality. Ash Shalloway, I think he said best. Most software problems will exhibit themselves as delays. What we're trying to do is get rid of those delays out of our system. Where is that waste in our system coming from? Because it's being exhibited as delays in our process. Respect for people. People do all the work, so respect them. Don't overload them. Don't make them wait. And be relentless in trying to improve. The inspect and adapt workshops, or retrospectives. So this is, like I said, this is Donald Reinerston's book. If you haven't got a copy of it, I would strongly recommend it. It's really the hip book in the industry is really saying, how do we apply lean to the design process? Because lean is often thought of more as a manufacturing approach. How do we bring that into the design process? Unfortunately, it's got a lot of queuing theory in it. It's a little bit dense, but you can get the gist of it very, very quickly. So some suggested reading. Dean Leffingwell's book, the frameworks at scaledagileFramework.com. Craig Larman's book, Scaling, Vascoda's Scaling Lean and Agile Development. Next steps, learn the framework. You can get training and certification. Get a release train going. So just to let you know, we are going to have a leading safe course on the 17th and 18th. So that will enable you to write the Scaled Agilist exam and be certified as a Scaled Agilist. If you're interested in deploying SAFe or really want to know, this is a really good course. The other thing too is on the 17th, we're going to have a bit of a networking event. So while there'll be the course attendees, we're going to have some of the vendors, some of the other people who've done, who are the Scaled Agilist program consultants will be here to answer more of your questions. So I want to thank you, and if we have any questions, I'm want to thank you for this.